Hello and welcome to DMR Collation's training on a beginner's guide to medical record analysis, presented by myself, Caroline Packer, owner and managing director of DMR Collation. So who are DMR Collation? Well, we are a pagination agency established in 2010 which provides services to lawyers in the collation and analysis of medical records. Whilst the majority of our instructions are in the areas of personal injury and clinical negligence litigation, we also work on other matters which require the collation and analysis of medical records, such as historic abuse, contentious probate, and family law proceedings. Our job, in a nutshell, is to assist law firms in preparing their cases for expert reporting. We are conscious that there are a large portion of claims where funding for professional collation and analysis of medical records will not be available. These lower value cases will still, however, require some degree of analysis in-house prior to the instruction of an expert. The aim of this training is to assist lawyers in running these cases more efficiently by allowing them to formulate a timeline of events, compile a list of missing records, so these can be obtained prior to expert instructions, identify any relevant pre-existing medical history, and prepare a list of injuries to help with early claim valuation. This training will also be useful to those legal practitioners who wish to have a better understanding of the work that is involved in the analysis of medical records, and will provide a number of helpful tips to help you with your understanding of medical records in general. Whilst you may not be in a position to formally collate the medical records, we recommend that as a bare minimum, you apply Bates numbering to the records, so each medical record has their own unique page reference, which can subsequently be referred to during your analysis. Let's take you through an overview of today's training. We will be looking at a beginner's guide to general practitioner records, a beginner's guide to hospital records, what constitutes a relevant pre-existing medical history, how to compile a list of injuries, how to compile a timeline of events, identification of missing records, exploration of redaction requirements and the perils of redaction software, schedules of radiology and why they're useful, and finally, some tips on how to prepare instructions for pagination companies. A beginner's guide to GP records. GP records, aka general practitioner records, are an invaluable source of information which should provide you with an overview of the majority of care which has been received by the claimant. It's tempting to obtain GP records from the index incident date only, but in doing so you won't be able to accurately determine any relevant pre-existing medical history, and there is always a possibility that you may have the wrong accident date noted on your file. As such, we always advise that full GP records are obtained. Prior to January 2001, GP surgeries recorded patient consultations on Lloyd George envelopes, which were named after the British former Prime Minister David Lloyd George. We have some photographs of the Lloyd George envelopes and clinical records on this slide for you to view. These envelopes were made of beige-coloured card measuring 13 centimetres by 18 centimetres, with red for male or blue for female print. They were used to record and store medical information on their patients. They included a wallet cover, a summary sheet to record main problems, a vaccination card, and then separate handwritten clinical note cards. Any received hospital letters or results would be folded and inserted into the envelope. In the latter part of the 20th century, as record keeping became more detailed and hospital interventions resulted in more documents, the Lloyd George envelopes became increasingly bulky. The layout and presentation of GP records changed dramatically in or around January 2001 with the introduction of the electronic patient care records. This was updated every time a relevant change was recorded in the GP record. Today, when you request copies of the GP records, you are sent a copy of the electronic patient care record, which forms part of a subject access request. Within the attachments, aka scanned documents section of the electronic patient care record, you will normally find the Lloyd George notes, earlier correspondence and investigation reports. Alternatively, these earlier records will be disclosed as separate photocopy documents in addition to the electronic patient care record. In some situations, these Lloyd George records have already been transcribed into the electronic patient care record, so the earlier paper records won't be disclosed. The electronic patient care record is normally provided electronically as a page-numbered PDF file. Once received, we advise that you double-check that all the pages of the electronic patient care record have been disclosed, as every now and then we will find that some pages are missing. The electronic patient care record normally follows the following layout in disclosure in ordering of information. A. Problems. This section provides a summary of prior and current medical issues, which provides a usual starting point for your review. The Problems section is subsectioned down into active, significant past, and minor past. If you find an entry of importance within the Problems section, you can then go on to locate and review the relevant matching consultation entry later in the electronic patient care record, should further information be required. B. Consultations. This section normally runs with the most recent entry first, i.e. in reverse chronological order. It is where the GP will document consultation discussions and outcomes to include any treatment plan formulated. It will also include administration staff entries recording receipt of correspondence and investigation results. You can use this section to cross-check that all correspondence received has actually been disclosed in the scanned documents section. C. Medications. These will provide a useful list of what medications have been prescribed on what date, normally distinguishable by active, repeat, and past prescriptions. D. Allergies. This is a summary list of any allergies recorded elsewhere in the electronic patient care record. E. Vaccinations. This is a list of all vaccinations administered, including batch numbers. F. Referrals. This is a dated list of referrals which have been made, which can later be cross-referenced to referral letters in the scanned documents section. G. Test results. This is a summarised list of investigation outcomes. And finally, H. Attachments, aka scanned documents. The title for this section varies in different GP surgeries, but this is essentially the section where correspondence or any other received document, such as A&E records, out-of-hours consultations, emails or faxes, are scanned into the electronic patient care record. Each document will have a scan date appear in a title strip above the document itself before the document is displayed below in the records as an image. When reviewing the electronic patient care record, you will need to double check that you haven't been provided with an abbreviated version of the care record. We often find issues with the electronic patient care record in that we have only been disclosed the consultation section of the records, or that the consultation section hasn't been expanded to show the full consultation notes, or even that full consultation records for the date period requested have not been disclosed. It is also increasingly common for GP surgeries to use automatic redaction software to remove third-party privileged information prior to disclosure. We will talk about redaction in more detail later, but at this stage I wanted to mention that upon receipt of the GP records, you will need to check that the records have not been inappropriately redacted prior to your full analysis taking place. For example, I recently received a set of records where the claimant's name had been redacted out of all of the disclosed correspondence. Not exactly useful. If you find the records have been inappropriately redacted, you will need to revert to the GP surgery immediately with a request that the records are reissued without the inappropriate redactions having been applied. Whilst removal of third-party privileged information is a legal requirement, this often is completed inappropriately by the GP surgery. It is useful to note that GP electronic patient records often don't just contain the GP clinical entries. It is now more increasingly common to find that they also contain clinical entries entered by community service providers, such as district nursing, podiatry, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, and physiotherapy. Because this is a possibility, it is always worth obtaining the GP records first, rather than directly applying for records from community providers. This is to double check that the records aren't enclosed within the GP set. Please don't underestimate the time that you may need to spend on reviewing the electronic patient care records from GP surgeries. If these also contain entries from other service providers which are relevant to the claim, they can be lengthy documents to review despite being relatively small on a page count basis. The electronic patient care record is normally disclosed as a searchable PDF document. If it isn't already searchable, this can easily be completed by running it through the necessary OCR software program. This is a really useful tool when you're searching for key terms within the electronic patient care record. However, please note that in our experience, the attached or scanned document section of the PDF isn't normally automatically searchable. This is because the scanned documents have been inputted into the electronic patient care record as images, not PDF text files. As such, further OCR software may need to be run on this document to ensure that it is fully searchable. So, in terms of helpful tips, we would recommend that you always obtain a full and complete set of GP records as a starting point. The GP records are often inappropriately redacted prior to disclosure. If this happens, don't forget to challenge this at the earliest opportunity. When reviewing medical records, you should check that the Lloyd George records and pre-2001 correspondence and investigations have been provided, as these are often not disclosed. And finally, the GP records sometimes include other community therapy service provider entries in the consultation section, so don't forget to check for this. We have completed our beginner's guide to GP records, but what about hospital records, and how do they differ from their GP counterparts? The contents of hospital records will vary from trust to trust, depending on the specialisms involved. In more recent times, the introduction of electronic patient care records within hospitals has resulted in a much higher percentage of these records being disclosed in electronic format rather than handwritten records, similar to that of GP records. However, when you request copies of hospital records, you can still expect to see a combination of both handwritten and computerized records being disclosed. Hospital records will typically include the following types of records: emergency department, urgent treatment centre or minor injury records, inpatient clinical notes. These are multidisciplinary records where all treating professionals record the treatment provided, outcome of investigations, examinations performed, and the planned ongoing care. Operation records, which should include the pre-assessment clinic notes, consent forms, anaesthetic records, operation notes, and theatre care booklets. Outpatient clinic letters, which are drafted to notify GPs of the outcome of outpatient clinic appointments. You would normally expect to see a clinic letter following each scheduled outpatient clinic appointment. Outpatient clinic clinical notes. Previously, you would expect to see a separate clinical note being written for each outpatient clinic attended, in addition to the clinic letter prepared following the clinic. Now, with the introduction of computerized records, it's more common that no separate outpatient clinical note is produced, with the clinic letter itself being the sole document for the outpatient consultation instead. However, this rule isn't written in stone and does vary from specialism to specialism and from trust to trust. A&E discharge summaries and inpatient discharge summaries. These documents offer a useful summary of each A&E or inpatient stay required, with a summary of diagnosis and or injuries, medical care provided, operations performed if required, investigation outcomes, medication prescribed, and the ongoing treatment plan on discharge. You will also find referral letters, which may be internal or external, requesting assistance from different specialisms. You will have other correspondence such as internal memos, emails, or telephone notes. You'll have results and investigations, which will include radiology imaging and imaging reports. Here you will need to ensure that both the imaging and the reports for the radiology have been disclosed, but please note that sometimes imaging isn't formally reported, and also sometimes the reports for the imaging can be located within the clinical notes themselves. You will have nursing records, and these will include nursing evaluations of care, nursing charts, care plans, and risk assessments. And along with that, you will also have medication administration records. Finally, I would expect you to find inpatient and or outpatient therapy records such as physiotherapy, occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, and dietitian records. Please note that these may be included in the inpatient clinical notes, or they may also be recorded in their own separate clinical booklets if they relate to outpatient appointments. When requesting hospital records from a trust, be sure to specify all hospitals under that trust that the claimant has received treatment from, to include all outpatient therapy services, such as physiotherapy. Otherwise, you may not get a complete set of records disclosed. We will now examine how to compile a list of injuries. As a starting point, we recommend that you review the initial ambulance and A&E records, imaging reports, and discharge summaries relating to the index incident. This will give you an initial basic list of the main injuries sustained by the claimant. The next step will be to expand those injuries out by reviewing the GP records to look at the problem list, and to also review any subsequent outpatient clinic letters, which often will list the main injuries in the headings of their letters. Finally, go back through and look at the inpatient clinical notes and look for the secondary and tertiary surveys performed. These will normally provide a list of additional injuries which may not have made the main problem list, such as bruising, grazing, and laceration injuries. Be mindful of the JSB guidelines and how they lay out their injury categorization, so you can do this in a similar method when compiling your own list of injuries. If the claimant has sustained a traumatic brain injury, then you will need to document exactly what this injury consists of. For example, is it a subarachnoid hemorrhage, a subdural hematoma? Exactly what part of the brain has been injured? What was their Glasgow Coma Scale, i.e. GCS, at the scene, and subsequently? And then put together a comprehensive list of what the outcome of this injury has been, i.e. what senses have been affected, and has cognition, personality, behaviour, and or mobility also been impacted. Against each category of injury, it is useful if you can summarise what treatment they have received for that injury, whether that be conservative or surgical, and what their current condition and prognosis is, if known. If the injury has fully resolved, try and put a timescale against that resolution, which will help with valuing the claim. If the records document that the claimant has required additional help, care, and assistance from their partner, friends, or family members, also make a note of this, as this will form part of an additional special damages care claim. If the claimant has required time off work following their injury, make a note of any sick notes which appear within the GP records indicating the duration of time signed off work and the reason for sick leave, as these will also form part of a loss of injuries or repayment of statutory sick pay claim. When compiling your list of injuries, also look for entries which support the claimant's special damages claim, i.e. sick notes in relation to potential loss of earnings or statutory sick pay repayments, entries recording that additional help, care and assistance was required, aids and equipment purchases, and private treatment paid for. Next, we will be looking at what constitutes a relevant pre-existing medical history. A pre-existing condition is a medical issue the claimant has experienced prior to the index incident. This includes chronic conditions such as diabetes and asthma, or one-off symptoms like elbow pain. A pre-existing condition is when you've had symptoms, medication, advice, treatment, or tests in relation to the same. Pre-existing conditions are relevant when considering the issue of causation, and as such, it is important to be able to put together a comprehensive list of all relevant pre-existing medical conditions for your expert to consider. When working out what would constitute a relevant pre-existing medical condition, you need to work backwards. First, start by compiling the list of injuries the claimant sustained as a direct result of the index incident. We have covered how to do this earlier. Once you have determined that list, you can work back through the GP and other records to check for any previous listed injuries to the same body parts. For example, if the claimant has sustained a traumatic brain injury, you will need to review the medical records to check for any previous head trauma, cognitive issues, or learning disabilities. If the claimant sustained a fractured left arm in the index incident, you are going to go back and check for any previous similar injuries. It would be normal for the claimant to have a lot of pre-existing medical conditions which have no bearing or relevance to the case, and in order to protect their privacy, these do not need to be included in the list of pre-existing medical conditions. The list should only contain relevant pre-existing medical history. When preparing the list of relevant pre-existing medical conditions, if the medical records document a full recovery from that injury prior to the index incident, then this information should also be included. Don't forget to include page references as to where you obtained the information from. This is so you can refer your expert to the specific page. If a psychiatric injury has been included in the list of injuries caused by the index incident, then you will need to include any reference to the claimant's previous mental state in your review, such as previous prescriptions of antidepressants, psychiatric illness diagnoses, or GP consultations discussing low mood, anxiety state, or depression. Please also note if the claimant has required any counselling treatment. Please also bear in mind that post-incident injuries and conditions may also be relevant to the issue of causation. If the claimant has gone on to sustain subsequent injuries which would have impacted on the injuries sustained in the index incident, then your list should also be extended to record these post-existing medical conditions as well. As a quick tip, if you're unsure whether a pre-existing condition is relevant or not, the best solution is to include it in your list and flag as a specific point of note for your expert to determine. Moving on, we are now going to look at how to compile a timeline of events. This can sometimes be a daunting task to complete, especially if the medical records you need to review are large and complex. However, our advice is to start with the ambulance records. This is to determine the initial accident information. Secondly, review the A&E and inpatient records to determine the injury sustained and admission details. Thirdly, review the GP records for relevant pre-existing medical history now you have a comprehensive list of injuries sustained. And finally, review the correspondence within the GP and hospital records to produce a summary of what treatment has been received as an inpatient and post-discharge. Make reference to all required treatment, current symptoms, and any effect the injuries had on them, their family, and their activities of daily living. Make a note of any future scheduled medical appointments so you can determine what further treatment is necessary and where any future requests for medical records should be made. If you are opting to prepare your own basic chronology, our advice is that you include entries relating to the following: any inpatient discharge summaries, any relevant imaging or other investigation reports, any relevant GP consultations, any issued sick notes, clinic letters for any outpatient appointments attended, any applicable operation notes to include post-operative instructions, any relevant therapy records such as physiotherapy, occupational therapy, and speech and language therapy, and any specialist information. For example, if the case concerns a medication administration error, then you will need to include all relevant prescription charts, medication administration records, and nursing notes. If the case relates to a specific reported incident, then you need to include the incident report. If you are not producing a formal chronology of the records, take the time instead to list out in chronologically ordered bullet points a basic timeline of events to include what treatment has been received. This will be invaluable in helping you to later identify what medical records may be missing. Always double check your type dates and page references as you prepare your timeline of events. It's really easy to type the wrong date against an entry, so it's good practice to proofread and check each entry before you proceed on to the next, as this will be much harder to spot and rectify further down the line. Okay, we are now halfway through our training session today. If you'd like to pause the training and take a short comfort break, this would be a good opportunity to do so. Hello and welcome back. Now, one of the key tasks that we complete for our clients is the identification of relevant missing records. So next we will be discussing how to complete missing records reviews. Missing record reviews are an essential task which will still need to be completed in situations where funding for professional pagination of medical records is not available. The identification of missing records is a much easier task to do if the records have first been chronologically collated and indexed prior to your analysis taking place. If, however, this hasn't been done, it is still possible to undertake a general review of the records to check whether all the appropriate records have been requested and disclosed. As a starting point, you will need to prepare your basic timeline of events, which will set out the information as to when, where, and what treatment the claimant has received for their injuries. We've shown you how to do this earlier in this training. Please note, however, that without first writing this basic timeline of events, it will be impossible to accurately determine what medical records are missing. You will need to write a list of those dates, medical centres and medical specialisms the claimant has received treatment from, and then compare this to the prepared medical record index and the disclosed records to ensure that all these relevant records have been received. Finally, prepare a separate list for all missing records itemised individually under each medical treatment centre, so these can be requested easily from each appropriate provider. A good tip here is to ensure that a review for missing medical records is undertaken prior to the instruction of the medical legal expert in order to avoid the requirement for additional costly supplementary reports because the relevant missing records are later identified by the expert. Moving on, we're now going to look at some common missing medical records we encounter on a regular basis during our missing records reviews. Here are some examples of what regularly gets flagged up within our lists of missing medical records. The ambulance service patient report forms, which are often located within the hospital's emergency department records, are often faint and poorly copied. However, these can be requested direct from the Ambulance Service NHS Trust if a better and clearer copy is required. With the ambulance service records, you may also wish to request the actual call recordings of the 999 calls. You will need to make a separate request for these if necessary from the Ambulance Trust, in addition to the ambulance patient report forms and call logs. And you can produce a transcript of these if not provided by the ambulance service themselves. Check that you don't need HEMS, which is Helicopter Emergency Medical Service records, in addition to the land ambulance records, as these will need to be requested from two different sources if not disclosed within the hospital's emergency department records. Always check that you have received the GP's earlier Lloyd George notes if the claimant was born before 2001. If you have only been sent the electronic patient care records, as explained earlier, these may form part of the scanned document section of the electronic records. If they haven't been disclosed and pre-existing medical history is relevant, these should be requested separately. With the GP electronic patient care record, you would need to check that the actual scanned documents, aka attachments, are included in the EPCR printout, as sometimes they can be excluded. Whilst a summary list of the documents is enclosed, the actual letters may not. So you will need to cross-check the scanned document list in the computerized records against letters actually received in full, as sometimes letters are missing. In addition, always check that you have received full GP correspondence. Often you may find that this cuts off at the point where the correspondence was scanned into the electronic patient care records, normally around 2007-2008. If this is missing and is of particular importance, this should also be requested. Physiotherapy records are commonly not disclosed along with the main hospital records. Make sure you specifically request these if you know your client has received outpatient physiotherapy care from the Trust. Also be sure to check they don't form part of the GP electronic patient care record. If your client has seen a therapist privately, make sure to request these records in addition to their NHS medical records. If the records are handwritten and difficult to interpret, you may need to ask the therapist to provide a letter summarising the treatment provided. Often there may be an indication within the records that clinical photographs have been taken, but these are often overlooked in disclosure and need to be requested separately. Clinical photographs are photographs taken by hospital staff whilst the claimant was an inpatient to document the progression of wound healing or a particular injury. Clinical, aka medical photographs, are very useful in demonstrating what the injuries were like at the time of the accident and are useful to obtain in any litigation which involves a period of delayed healing or infection or where the claimant has been left with scarring. Double check you have operation notes relating to all the relevant operations. Often operation notes are missing, as these are disclosed separately to other theatre records such as consent forms, anaesthetic records and surgery packs. Please also bear in mind that operation notes may be handwritten, typed, or both. Let's now discuss the issue of redaction. Redaction of medical records is the process of removing sensitive information from any document. Healthcare providers use redaction to ensure the information they share internally or externally does not compromise anyone's privacy or security. Redaction also makes it easy to share documents that contain sensitive information. Article 15 of the GDPR, which was incorporated into UK law by the Data Protection Act 2018, specifies that the data subject's right to a copy of his or her data shall not adversely affect the rights and freedoms of others. Therefore, it is necessary to redact documents and records to ensure that a response to a subject access request does not accidentally disclose another individual's personal data. Within a healthcare setting, the redaction of medical records is a three-step process, which involves the scanning of documents to identify personally identifiable information for the redaction process, removal of all personally identifiable information, and the storing of redacted files for future use. So, what data should be redacted from medical records? Firstly, potentially harmful information should be redacted to protect the claimant's privacy, to include their contact information, which may be email or phone numbers, national insurance numbers, and any other sensitive information. Secondly, all third-party information, which is not directly relevant to the claim, to include their names, addresses, contact information, and dates of birth, should be redacted. When applying your own redactions, please ensure you do this in a PDF format using an appropriate redaction tool. Redaction of records in a Word document doesn't offer adequate protection of sensitive information, And if you choose to redact a record by hand using black marker pen, when the document is rescanned, often text can still be readable in the scanned document itself. And finally, don't forget to keep a separate unredacted version of any medical records for your file. You will need to check the disclosed records for any records relating to different patients. Unfortunately, this happens on an extremely regular basis. If you have received a record relating to a different patient mixed up in with your own client records, then it's probably because the healthcare provider has misfiled those records at source. For data protection reasons, the healthcare provider will need to know about this error so they can rectify this and report the breach. These records need to be removed once identified. Unfortunately, sometimes it is not always possible to identify these records at the initial collation stage, but they are normally picked up once a comprehensive review of the records has taken place. So, why are we talking about redaction in our guide to medical record analysis? Well, this is because the automatic redaction software applied by GP surgeries unfortunately can often make interpreting records extremely difficult. If you believe inappropriate redactions have been applied, then you will need to raise this with the GP surgery and request a version of the records to be provided without the inappropriate redactions having been marked. Inappropriate redactions, I hear you question? Surely not. Well, unfortunately, this is an increasingly regular problem. I've already referred to the set of GP records sent to us for collation where the GP had redacted the claimant's name from all the disclosed correspondence. However, let me share some further examples with you of the type of inappropriate redactions we at DMR Collation have to deal with on a regular basis. This is an entry from a GP consultation which reads as follows. For advice, serious RTA 14 weeks ago, sustained multiple fractures including her pelvis. Now back at work as a redacted word, currently doing shorter 5-hour shifts. Has noticed increased aches and pains around her pelvis since started back at work. Also walked a quarter of a mile to work. No saddle anesthesia, no cordia equina, no numbness, pins, needles or alarm features. Discussed common sense approach, monitor and seek review if, redacted word. Here, we aren't allowed to know what the claimant's occupation is or when the claimant needs to seek a further review with their GP. Redaction example number 2. This is an entry from the attachment section of the GP electronic patient care record, which reads as follows. Clinic letter from St. Redacted Words Hospital, NHS Hospitals, to White Redacted Word Surgery. In this redaction example, we aren't allowed to know the full name of the hospital or the GP surgery. For your information, it was actually a clinic letter sent from St James's Hospital to White Rose Surgery. The redaction software has picked up James and Rose and treated it inappropriately as third-party sensitive information, which, in this case, it clearly was not. In this next redaction example, the word bite was redacted from both the problem summary list and the consultation record itself. This is an extract from a rehabilitation prescription. Apparently, we aren't allowed to know the full details of the claimant's fractures. Luckily, an unredacted version of this rehabilitation prescription was located within the hospital records. And here is the unredacted version, located within the hospital records which we used in the chronology. It would appear that the word pubic is too rude to be mentioned despite it being medical terminology. But why should we have all the fun? It's now your turn to play Redaction Destruction. So here we have an extract from a clinic letter. It reads, left redacted word, radius fracture, which was also managed conservatively in a full cast. Any ideas? And the answer, of course, is distal. Who knew this would be deemed privileged information, eh? Okay, who's ready for redaction question 2? Here we have an extract from a GP electronic patient care record problem list. It reads, mixed, redacted word, and depressive disorder. Redacted word with depression. And the answer is anxiety. Here we have another extract from a GP electronic patient care record problem list, which reads, redacted word, irritation. Any thoughts on this one? And the answer is, we haven't a clue, I'm afraid. We couldn't find any additional information within the electronic patient care record, which is why these redactions can be so frustrating, as we have no way of knowing whether this entry is of any relevance to the case or not. If I were to hazard a guess, however, I would probably guess redaction irritation. Well, that's the end of our game of redaction distraction, but don't worry, I'm sure this game will be available again at your desk very soon. Next, we're moving on to schedules of radiology and how they can be useful in identifying missing imaging and reports. If you have the time and it's relevant to the case, preparing a schedule of radiology in the matter can be very helpful in determining whether any imaging or associated radiology reports are missing. Start by preparing a list of radiology images disclosed by the Trust and cross-reference these with the disclosed records. You will need to review all disclosed radiology reports, the GP records, clinical notes, and relevant correspondence to ensure that you have received images for all radiology taken, and, if that image was formally reported, the radiology report for that imaging. Please note that sometimes radiology reports are contained within hospital inpatient discharge summaries under the investigation section, so if a formal radiology report has not been disclosed, you may still be able to pick up a description of the findings from the discharge summary. Physical CD-ROMs of radiology images which are sent through the post are easily corrupted, and they need to be password protected. If you need to share imaging this way with your expert, you may wish to consider using a pagination company such as DMR Collation, who offer a radiology hosting solution to avoid any issues with viewing and sharing radiology images. Using such platforms will also help to ensure that you have all relevant radiology prior to proceeding. Please note that radiology can be tricky to access if you don't have the right software installed on your computer. Always ask the record provider to clarify what software is required to view the radiology, so you can ask your IT department to get this installed safely on your computer. Here we have enclosed an example of what a basic schedule of radiology may look like. We have 6 columns to include the date the image was performed, the date it was reported, the image description, the healthcare provider's name, whether the image has been disclosed, and finally, whether there is an associated imaging report which has also been disclosed. If your records have been collated and page numbered, you may also wish to include a column for the page number of any disclosed radiology report within your schedule. If you have sufficient funding to instruct a pagination company such as DMR Collation to collate and analyse the records for you, here are some additional tips on how you can ensure the case is prepared correctly for pagination in order to keep your collation costs to a minimum. Please supply the records to pagination companies exactly as they have been received by you. Don't be tempted to combine the files together, because within each document's file properties, there could be bookmarks or file names which are important for your pagination company to be able to extract, as this may help them identify the timelines relating to documents. This is particularly important with documents such as clinical photographs or screenshots of text messages, which might not otherwise be dated. This will also greatly assist in the pagination company being able to consider whether to digitally collate the records, as opposed to printing, sorting and scanning, which may ultimately save costs, preserve the image quality better, and is obviously more environmentally friendly. Please also don't send the records for applications such as bundle docs with automatic page numbering applied, as this will need to be removed upon receipt, something which often cannot easily be done. Don't drip feed the medical records to your pagination company. It's tempting to send records out to your pagination company as and when they are received. However, unless the matter is time sensitive, it's best practice to wait until you have received all the medical records and radiology before sending instructions. This will avoid updates having to be made to an already collated set of records or an already prepared chronology, thus reducing the amount of pagination fees being incurred. Consider asking your pagination company to perform a missing records review on the collated set of records before advancing to preparing a full chronology of the records. A comprehensive missing records review will normally take a professional analyst 2 to 3 hours to complete and can be a massive cost and time-saving tool if this flags relevant missing records which will need to be obtained before a complete chronology or medical report can be produced. When drafting your instructions to pagination companies, please provide as much detail regarding the injury circumstances and allegations of negligence as possible. The more information you share with your pagination company, the better equipped they will be to identify the key issues in the claim. Most pagination companies have an instruction form that they will ask you to complete, so please fill this out with as much detail as possible. If your pagination company calls you to clarify the instructions, please find the time to speak to them promptly regarding the matter. Often these inquiries are time sensitive and the work has often been paused until instructions have been clarified. If instructions aren't entirely clear or additional issues have been flagged during the collation process, often this will just need a quick 5-minute conversation with you to check how you would like the instructions to be progressed. Most pagination companies see themselves as an extension of your own team, so it's good to be able to build up a healthy working relationship where telephone or email communication can easily clarify your precise requirements on a case. If you need your instructions to be dealt with urgently, try to give your pagination company as much notice of this as possible. Even if you don't expect to be in a position to send instructions for a few more weeks, if you know you will need a quick turnaround on a case once the records do come in, let your pagination company know as early as possible so they can pencil in some provisional resources for you on this. And that is the end of my beginner's guide to medical record analysis. It's been a pleasure to share with you today some of my knowledge and experience, having run my own pagination company for the last 14 years. I hope this training has been helpful and it has achieved the aim of giving you insight into how to extract the necessary information from medical records and to assist you in running your cases more efficiently. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if you wish to provide any training feedback or believe DMR Collation can help with any of your pagination or analysis requirements. And lastly, I'd like to wish you happy analysing.